The midbrain is the upper part of the brainstem. It connects the pons and cerebellum with the forebrain. It is traversed by a narrow channel, which is called the cerebral aqueduct, and this connects the third and fourth ventricles. On the posterior surface, there are 4 colliculi or corpora quadrigemina, and these are rounded eminences that are divided into superior and inferior pairs. The superior colliculi, which is the level of this section, are centers for visual reflexes. The inferior colliculi are lower auditory centers. Below the inferior colliculi, the trochlear nerves emerge. These are small diameter nerves that wind around the lateral aspect of the midbrain. The fibers cross the midline, and they are the only fibers of cranial nerves that arise from the dorsal part of the brain. On the anterior aspect of the midbrain, there is a deep depression in the midline, which is called the interpeduncular fossa. This is bounded on either side by the Crus cerebri. Many small blood vessels, central arteries, from the circle of Willis, they perforate the floor of the interpeduncular fossa, and this region is termed the posterior perforated substance. The oculomotor nerve, whose nucleus is located at the level of the superior colliculus, emerges from a groove on the medial side of the Crus cerebri within the interpeduncular fossa. So here you can see that there are 2 cranial nerves attached to the midbrain. The third cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve, at the level of the superior colliculus, and the fourth cranial nerve at the level of the inferior colliculus. Although the trochlear nerve leaves dorsally, inferior to the inferior colliculus, but then it passes ventrally around the cerebral peduncles and goes into the cavernous sinus, lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Each cerebral peduncle is divided into anterior part, which is called the Crus cerebri, and a posterior part, the tegmentum. This division is done by a pigmented band of gray matter, which is called the Substantia nigra. The Substantia nigra is present at all levels of the midbrain, so we can find it at the level of the superior and inferior colliculus of the midbrain. It's a pigment containing nuclear area, contains melanin pigment. It has multiple connections, and it is involved with the control of motor activities. Its degeneration is associated with development of Parkinson's disease. Again, I repeat that the Substantia nigra is located at the border between the Crus cerebri and the tegmentum. The narrow cavity of the midbrain, as has been mentioned earlier, is the cerebral aqueduct, and this connects the third and fourth ventricles. The tectum is the part of the midbrain that is located posterior to the cerebral aqueduct. The tectum is the part that has 4 small elevations, the colliculi, superior and inferior colliculi. The cerebral aqueduct is surrounded by a central gray matter, a periaqueductal gray matter. The Crus cerebri contains descending tracts from the cerebral cortex. These descending tracts are arranged according to destination. So the lateral ones are temporopontine fibers, and the medial ones are the frontopontine fibers. In between are the corticospinal and corticobulbar fibers. The temporopontine and frontopontine fibers are going to relay in pontine nuclei in the basal part of the pons, and they continue as pontocerebellar fibers through the middle cerebellar peduncles. Corticobulbar and corticonuclear fibers are going to be broken here at the pons by the transversely running pontocerebellar fibers. In the medulla, the corticospinal fibers, they form the pyramids. 3/4 of the fibers of the pyramids will cross at the lower part of the medulla oblongata and form the lateral corticospinal tract. The uncrossed fibers will form the anterior corticospinal tract. These fibers will cross at segmental levels of spinal cord and terminate at anterior horn cells. The corticobulbar and corticospinal fibers are motor fibers. They control voluntary motor activity. They are concerned with performing rapid skilled movements. Some of the fibers terminate at motor nuclei of cranial nerves, hence they are called corticobulbar. Others terminate at anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, hence the fibers are called corticospinal fibers. The corticopontine fibers are the main pathway linking the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum, and they are responsible for coordination of fine movements. The inferior colliculus consists of a large nucleus of gray matter that lies beneath the corresponding surface elevation, inferior colliculus. It forms part of the auditory pathway. It receives many of the terminal fibers of the lateral lemniscus. The fibers carry auditory sensations from the inner ear and relay in the auditory nuclei, which are located in the upper part of the medulla and lower part of the pons. And then the second order neurons from these cochlear nuclei, they will cross the midline and form the trapezoid body. Then the fibers will ascend in the lateral lemniscus. This is the lateral lemniscus at the region of the pons. Actually, it is the medial lemniscus here, and the medial lemniscus at the lateral part of it contains fibers of the lateral lemniscus. These fibers of the lateral lemniscus, they ascend up into the lower part of the midbrain, into the inferior colliculus, and then fibers will pass through the inferior brachium into the medial geniculate body of the thalamus. The medial geniculate body of the thalamus contains neurons of auditory function responsible for hearing, and it will project to the auditory cortex of the cerebrum. At the level of the inferior colliculus, the periaqueductal gray matter, the central gray matter here, contains the trochlear nucleus close to the median plane, and it is located just posterior to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This is the medial longitudinal fasciculus here at this level. We can also follow the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the floor of the fourth ventricle, close to the midline and at the pons. And here again in the medulla, this is the region of the medial longitudinal fasciculus, close to the midline and at the floor of the fourth ventricle. The medial longitudinal fasciculus contains ascending and descending fibers. These fibers, they connect the cochlear nuclei and the vestibular nuclei that are located in the medulla. This is the vestibular nuclear complex at the medulla, and the vestibular nuclei that are located at the pons. So the medial longitudinal fasciculus connects these vestibular and cochlear nuclei with nuclei controlling extraocular muscles, and these include the abducent nucleus in the pons. So the medial longitudinal fasciculus connects this abducent nucleus with other nuclei that supply extraocular muscles, and these include the trochlear nucleus at the lower part of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculus, and also the oculomotor nerve, which is located at the level of the superior colliculus. And so here again we can see this is the medial longitudinal fasciculus that is so closely related to the motor nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. The medial longitudinal fasciculus, through its connections, is responsible for the neural control of the gaze, vertical and horizontal control, synchronizing the eye movements. The mesencephalic nuclei of the trigeminal nerve are also located in the periaqueductal gray matter on the lateral side of the central gray matter. Here again we can see the mesencephalic nucleus in the upper part of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus. This nucleus is responsible for sensory modalities of discriminative touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception. The decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncles occupies the central part of the tegmentum in front of the cerebral aqueduct. The reticular formation is smaller than that of the pons or the medulla and is situated lateral to the decussaiton of the superior cerebellar peduncles. The reticular formation is formed of a net of nerve cells and nerve fibers, hence the name reticular, which means net. The net extends through the axis of the nervous system from the spinal cord to the cerebrum. It receives input from most of the sensory systems and has efferent fibers that descend and influence nerve cells at all levels of the central nervous system. Through its many connections, it can influence skeletal muscle activity, somatic and visceral sensations, the autonomic and endocrine systems, and even the level of consciousness. In the spinal cord, this is the site of the reticulospinal tract. The medial lemniscus is located posterior to the substantia nigra. This fiber bundle here includes the medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, and the lateral lemniscus. We can also see it here in the upper part of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus. The origin of the fibers of the medial lemniscus was from the posterior horn of the spinal cord, where there is the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. These fibers, they carry discriminative touch vibration and proprioception, conscious proprioception. The fibers will relay in the cuneate and gracile nuclei in the lower part of the medulla, and then fibers of second order neuron from the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus, they cross the midline and ascend up as the medial lemniscus. So this is the medial lemniscus at the level of the medulla oblongata. And then the medial lemniscus rotates at the level of the pons, and we can see it here. The medial lemniscus at the pons and the midbrain is associated with fibers of the lateral lemniscus and fibers of the spinal lemniscus. Spinal lemniscus fibers originally are fibers of the lateral spinothalamic and anterior spinothalamic tracts in the spinal cord. These are crossed fibers that are derived from substantia gelatinosa and nucleus proprius in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and they form the spinal lemniscus in the medulla, and then they come close together to the fibers of the medial lemniscus. The trigeminal lemniscus that join these lemnisci, the medial, lateral, and spinal lemniscus, the trigeminal lemniscus is formed of fibers of sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve that carry sensation of all modalities from the face and proprioceptive sensations from the muscles of the face. These fibers are carried in their way to the thalamus. In the thalamus, third order neurons, sensory neurons, are located, and the axons of these thalamic nuclei, they terminate on sensory cortical areas. Now let's deal with more details on a section at the upper part of the midbrain at the level of the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is a large nucleus of gray matter that lies beneath the corresponding surface elevation, superior colliculus, the upper two of the four corpora quadrigemina. The superior colliculus forms part of the visual reflexes. It is connected to the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus by the superior brachium. So the inferior colliculus is connected to the medial geniculate body of the thalamus through the inferior brachium. It has auditory function, while the superior colliculus is connected to the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus by the superior brachium, and it has visual function. The superior colliculus receives afferent fibers from the optic nerve, from the visual cortex, and receives spinotactal fibers from the spinal cord. This spinotectal pathway provides afferent information for spinovisual reflexes, and it brings about movements of the eyes and head toward the source of the stimulation. The efferent fibers form the tectospinal tract and tectobulbar tracts for the cranial nerve nuclei. The tectospinal and tectobulbar tracts are responsible for the reflex movements of the eyes, head, and neck in response to visual stimuli. The afferent pathway for the light reflex ends in the pretectal nucleus. This is a group of neurons situated close to the lateral part of the superior colliculus. After relaying in the pretectal nucleus, the fibers pass to the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. This nucleus is also called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Some of the fibers of the pretectal nuclei end at the ipsilateral Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Other fibers, they cross the midline through the posterior commissure and end up in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus on the contralateral side. Fibers of neurons in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus are going to accompany the oculomotor nerve. These are preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, and they relay at the ciliary ganglia. The postganglionic fibers from the ciliary ganglion travel through short ciliary nerves to the sphincter pupillae muscle. Nerve fibers that terminate at the pretectal nuclei originate from the lateral geniculate body and pass through the superior brachium. The lateral geniculate body receives fibers from the optic tract. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus also receives afferent fibers from the prefrontal cortex. Some of these fibers are directed to the motor nucleus of the oculomotor nerve to supply the medial rectus. Others are directed to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and these fibers are responsible for the innervation of the pupillary muscle and the ciliary muscle. Ciliary muscle and the pupillary muscle contraction is required for the accommodation reflex. It is therefore clear that the fibers that are responsible for the light reflex are required to involve the pretectal nuclei, while the fibers that are involved in the accommodation reflex go directly to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Because of this difference in the central connections of the visual light reflex and the accommodation reflex, then they may be dissociated in diseases of the central nervous system. In central nervous system syphilis, there is dissociation between the pupillary light reflex and the accommodation reflex. The pupillary light reflex is lost, but the accommodation reflex is not lost, which means that the site of involvement here in central nervous system is in the pretectal nuclei, which are involved in the pathway for the pupillary light reflex, but they are not involved in the pathway for the accommodation reflex. This dissociation is known as the Argyll Robertson pupil. The pupil reacts to accommodation but not to the light reflex. Again, here at this section you can see that the oculomotor nucleus is situated in the central gray matter close to the median plane. It is located just posterior to the medial longitudinal fasciculus that connects it with the trochlear nucleus, with the abducent nucleus, and with the cochlear and vestibular nuclei, which are located in the pons and the middle lobe longata. The fibers of this oculomotor nucleus, motor nucleus of the oculomotor, they pass anteriorly through the red nucleus. This is the site of the red nucleus. It is a characteristic feature of a section at the superior colliculus. The oculomotor nerve passes through the red nucleus and emerges on the medial side of the Crus cerebri in the interpeduncular fossa. This nucleus of oculomotor nerve is responsible for the supply of the extraocular muscles, all the extraocular muscles, except the lateral rectus, which is supplied by the abducent nerve, and the superior oblique, which is supplied by the trochlear nerve. All the other muscles, including the levator palpebris superioris, superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique muscles are supplied by the oculomotor nucleus. The medial, spinal, and trigeminal lemnisci, they form a curved band posterior to the substantia nigra, as we have just mentioned earlier. Now here, this band does not include the lateral lemniscus, because the lateral lemniscus does not extend superiorly to this level. The lateral lemniscus ends at the level of the inferior colliculus. It is the ascending fibers that are responsible for hearing, and they terminate at the level of the inferior colliculus. The red nucleus is a rounded mass of gray matter that is situated between the cerebral aqueduct and the substantia nigra. Its reddish hue is seen in fresh specimens. And this reddish hue and the name red nucleus is due to its high vascularity and the presence of an iron-containing pigment in the cytoplasm of many of its neurons. The red nucleus is a characteristic feature of a section at the level of the superior colliculus. Sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate between section at the superior or inferior colliculus. So the characteristic feature here is the presence of the red nucleus at the level of the superior colliculus, because the substantia nigra is located throughout all levels of the midbrain, but the red nucleus is only located at the level of the superior colliculus. So wherever you find the red nucleus, then you expect to find the oculomotor nucleus, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and the superior colliculus. The red nucleus has multiple connections. It receives fibers from the cerebral cortex through the corticospinal tract. It receives from the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, from basal ganglia and hypothalamic nuclei, substantia nigra, and the spinal cord. Efferent fibers leave the red nucleus and pass to the spinal cord through the rubrospinal tract. This is the location of the rubrospinal tract and the spinal cord. As this tract descends, it decussates. The red nucleus is also connected and sends efferent fibers to the reticular formation. It sends fibers to the thalamus and to the substantia nigra. In vascular disorders of the midbrain, occlusion of a branch of the posterior cerebral artery might result in Weber's syndrome. This affects the oculomotor nerve and results in ipsilateral ophthalmoplegia, lateral deviation of the eyeball, ptosis, dilated pupil, fixed to light, and accommodation because of the involvement of the motor fibers of the trigeminal nerve and the involvement of the fibers that originate from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus as well. The eye laterally deviates because of the intact lateral rectus muscle, which is supplied by the abducent nerve. Involvement of the crus by the occlusion of the artery results in contralateral paralysis because the crus contains the corticospinal fibers, and this results in upper motor neuron lesion. This upper motor neuron lesion will affect the lower face. It will affect the tongue, arm, and leg on the contralateral side of the body, resulting from involvement of corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. The corticonuclear fibers that supply the motor nuclei of the facial nerve and the hypoglossal nerve, which are located lower down. The facial nerve nucleus is located in the pons, and the hypoglossal nucleus is located in the medulla oblongata. Occlusion of a branch of the posterior cerebral artery might result in Benedict's syndrome if it affects the midbrain. Here, the medial lemniscus will be involved, and this results in contralateral hemianesthesia because these fibers of the medial lemniscus, they carry pain, temperature, touch, and pressure sensations from the contralateral side of the body. Involvement of the red nucleus by the vascular occlusion results in involuntary movements of the limbs on the opposite side because the rubrospinal tract is across the tract. As you can see here, this is the rubrospinal tract that descends into the spinal cord, and the fibers, they cross before they descend. Because the midbrain passes through the tentorial notch, then external compression might take place when there is a supratentorial lesion resulting in herniation of the uncus through the tentorial notch. This compression might affect the third and fourth cranial nerves, oculomotor and trochlear. In addition to the posterior cerebral artery might be affected. The effect could be a direct effect of the compression, ipsilateral, on the same side of the compression, or it might be contralateral because the herniated part might push the midbrain against the sharp edge of the tentorium on the contralateral side. One point to be mentioned about the cerebral aqueduct: it is easily blocked because it is the narrowest part of the ventricular system of the brain. So a pathology of the midbrain might easily block the cerebral aqueduct. Also, in congenital hydrocephalus, the cerebral aqueduct may be blocked or replaced by numerous small tubular passages that are insufficient for the normal flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Sometimes, not only a tumor of the midbrain, but pressure on the midbrain from a tumor arising outside the midbrain may compress the aqueduct and produce hydrocephalus. When the cerebral aqueduct is blocked, the cerebrospinal fluid will accumulate in the third and lateral ventricles.